Eleanor had arrived that evening with hope fluttering in her chest like a caged bird, believing that the marriage contract signed by their parents years before would be honored, that her position as the future Duchess was secure despite her lack of fortune or grand connections. She had spent weeks preparing for this moment, practicing her curtsy, memorizing the names and titles of everyone who mattered, telling herself that love might come later, but respect would be enough to begin with. But the Duke had other plans, and as the orchestra struck up a waltz, he crossed the ballroom floor with purposeful strides toward the radiant Miss Cecilia Hartley, whose golden curls and emerald gown had captured the attention of every man in attendance, and whose father's banking fortune made her the most sought-after prize of the season. What happened next would be seared into Eleanor's memory, with the burning permanence of a brand pressed into tender flesh. The Duke took Miss Hartley's gloved hand with a tenderness he had never shown Eleanor during their brief, formal meetings. And then, with the entire ballroom watching in scandalized fascination, he announced in a voice that carried to every corner of the room that he could not in good conscience bind himself to a marriage arranged in his youth to a woman of no consequence, no beauty, and no fortune worthy of the Thornfield name. Eleanor felt the words land like physical blows, each one stripping away another layer of the dignity she had wrapped around herself so carefully. The whispers began immediately, a rustling sound like dead leaves blown across cobblestones, and she could feel hundreds of eyes upon her, dissecting her plain features, her unfashionable gown, her trembling hands that clutched at her grandmother's simple pearl necklace as though it were a lifeline. Lady Margaret Thornfield, the Duke's formidable mother, sat rigid in her chair near the fireplace, her face carved from ice, offering no defense of the girl who should have become her daughter-in-law, no acknowledgement that a contract had been broken and a reputation destroyed. Helena wanted to flee, to run from that glittering room and never stop running. But her legs would not obey her, and so she stood there for what felt like an eternity, watching as the Duke led Miss Hartley onto the dance floor, watching as they moved together with the perfect synchronicity of two people who belonged in that world of wealth and privilege, a world that had never truly been meant for someone like her. The following morning, Eleanor departed London in a hired coach with nothing but 2 small trunks containing her meagre possessions and a heart so thoroughly shattered that she wondered if it would ever beat properly again. She had no home to return to, as her family's small estate had been sold to pay her father's debts after his death, and the distant relatives who had grudgingly housed her before the engagement made it clear that a jilted bride with a ruined reputation was not welcome under their roof. For weeks Eleanor drifted through the English countryside, taking positions as a companion to elderly ladies or a governess to unruly children, each placement more desperate than the last, until finally she found herself in the northern industrial city of Manchester, far from the glittering ballrooms of London, in a world of smoking chimneys and practical people who cared more about your character than your pedigree. It was there, in the drawing room of a modest but comfortable townhouse, that she met Lord Edmund Blackwood, a self-made man of 55 who had built an empire in railroads and coal mines through sheer determination and business acumen. He was a widower seeking a wife not for love or heirs, having already raised his children to adulthood, but for companionship and someone to manage his household during his final years. He looked at Eleanor with kind, tired eyes and saw not a disgraced woman but someone who had survived something terrible and come out the other side still standing. He offered her a marriage of convenience with complete honesty about his expectations, and Eleanor, with nowhere else to turn and nothing left to lose, accepted. What Eleanor could not have known that grey Manchester morning was that Lord Blackwood would prove to be the greatest blessing of her life, disguised in the form of a practical arrangement. He treated her with unfailing respect and gentleness, never demanding more than she was willing to give, and during their 2 years together before his heart finally gave out, he taught her everything about his business empire with the patience of a father instructing a beloved daughter. He saw in her a sharp intelligence that had been dismissed by others, a head for numbers and strategy that flourished when given the opportunity to bloom. And when he died peacefully in his sleep one winter night, he left her not just his fortune, but the knowledge and confidence to manage it. Eleanor grieved for him sincerely, for he had been her savior and her friend, and she honored his memory by taking the business acumen he had taught her and multiplying his already substantial wealth through careful investments and bold ventures that made seasoned businessmen shake their heads in amazement. Within 3 years of his death, the former Miss Eleanor Ashworth, now the widowed Lady Blackwood, had become one of the wealthiest women in England, her fortune exceeding that of many ancient noble families, her name appearing in financial papers alongside titans of industry, her opinion sought by bankers and railway magnates. And then, on a crisp autumn morning in London, Eleanor's solicitor brought her news that made her heart stop and then begin beating again with a rhythm that felt like destiny knocking at her door. Ravenmore Estate, the ancestral seat of the Dukes of Ravenmore for 3 centuries, was to be auctioned to satisfy the Duke's crushing debts. Alexander Thornfield, it seemed, had made a series of catastrophic investments guided by Miss Cecilia Hartley, who had become his wife and then promptly emptied his accounts before abandoning him for a younger, wealthier Marquess. The proud Duke, who had once declared Eleanor beneath his notice, was now facing financial ruin, forced to sell the very symbol of his family's power and prestige. Eleanor sat in her elegant London townhouse, surrounded by the trappings of her hard-won success, and felt something shift inside her chest, something that was neither quite revenge nor quite justice, but somewhere beautifully between the two. She instructed her solicitor to attend the auction and secure Ravenmore Estate regardless of cost, and when the hammer fell and the property passed into her hands, she allowed herself a smile that held both triumph and a strange, unexpected sadness for the girl she had been 5 years ago, standing frozen in that ballroom, believing her life was ending when it was actually about to truly begin. The news of the sale rippled through London society like a stone thrown into a still pond, the shockwaves reaching every drawing room and gentleman's club in the city. Eleanor Ashworth, the nobody who had been so publicly humiliated, had returned as Lady Blackwood and purchased the Duke of Ravenmore's ancestral home out from under him, and society could speak of nothing else. Some called it poetic justice, others called it vulgar revenge, but everyone agreed it was the most delicious scandal in years, and invitations to Eleanor's upcoming house party at Ravenmore Estate became the most coveted pieces of paper in England. Eleanor stood at the grand entrance of Ravenmore Estate on a morning wrapped in autumn mist, her gloved hand resting lightly on the iron railing as she surveyed the property that now belonged to her with a mixture of emotions she had not anticipated feeling. The house rose before her like a monument to old England, its grey stone walls weathered by centuries of rain and wind, its countless windows reflecting the pale sky like watchful eyes, and she found herself remembering the first time she had seen it years ago, when she had been brought here as a nervous bride-to-be to meet the Duke's family. Then she had felt like an intruder, a sparrow who had accidentally flown into an eagle's nest, and Lady Margaret had made certain Eleanor understood exactly how far beneath the Thornfield standards she fell. Now standing here as the legal owner of every stone, every tree, every blade of grass, Eleanor felt a power she had never imagined possible, yet it came with an unexpected hollowness, as though victory without witness was somehow incomplete. The Duke himself had sent 3 letters in the weeks following the auction, each more desperate than the last, and Eleanor had read them with careful attention to every word, every phrase that revealed just how far the proud Alexander Thornfield had fallen. He begged permission to remain in the estate's east wing, while he arranged alternative accommodations for his mother and himself, citing his family's 300 years of unbroken residence at Ravenmore, as though history could pay debts or repair broken promises. Helena had considered refusing, had imagined the satisfaction of forcing him into rented rooms in some middling part of London, watching him experience the kind of displacement and humiliation she had endured. But something in her, perhaps the part that Lord Blackwood had nurtured with his patient kindness, recognized that true vindication required proximity, required the Duke to witness exactly what he had discarded, to live daily with the reality that the woman he had deemed unworthy now held his entire world in her elegant hands. She granted his request with conditions that made her ownership unmistakably clear, stipulating that he would occupy only the rooms she designated, follow the household routines she established, and present himself for dinner each evening as though he were a guest in what had once been his ancestral home. The first dinner was an exquisite torture that Eleanor orchestrated with the precision of a general planning a campaign. She had the servants set the table in the formal dining room, where family portraits of Thornfield ancestors glowered down from the walls, their painted eyes seeming to judge the audacity of the woman now seated at the head of their table. Eleanor wore a gown of deep sapphire silk that had cost more than her entire wardrobe from 5 years ago, her dark hair dressed in the latest fashion, her throat and ears adorned with diamonds that caught the candlelight and scattered it across the room like captured stars. When the Duke entered, she watched his face carefully, cataloguing every micro-expression that crossed his aristocratic features as he took in the transformation of the plain, forgettable girl into this self-possessed woman of obvious wealth and refinement. He had aged in the years since their last meeting, she noted. New lines etched around his eyes and mouth, a certain weariness in his bearing that spoke of sleepless nights and the particular strain that comes from watching your world crumble while being powerless to stop it. They spoke little during that first meal, the silence broken only by the clink of silverware against fine china and the measured footsteps of servants moving through their carefully choreographed duties. Eleanor asked polite questions about his mother's health and his plans for the future, her tone perfectly calibrated to convey neither cruelty nor warmth, simply the distant courtesy one might show to any temporary resident. The Duke answered in clipped sentences, his pride clearly warring with his circumstances, and she could see him struggling with the fundamental reversal of their positions, the way power had shifted so completely that he now depended upon her generosity for the very roof over his head. When the meal concluded and he rose to excuse himself, Eleanor remained seated, letting him stand there waiting for her dismissal like a servant rather than the master of the house he had been born to be. And only after a long, deliberate pause did she incline her head slightly, granting him permission to leave his own family's dining room. In the days that followed, Eleanor established herself as mistress of Ravenmore, with an efficiency that impressed even the long-serving staff who had initially viewed her with skepticism and barely concealed disdain. She reviewed every aspect of the estate's management, from the tenant farms to the household accounts, and what she discovered both shocked and saddened her, evidence of years of neglect and mismanagement that spoke to the Duke's complete lack of practical knowledge or interest in the actual workings of his inheritance. She implemented changes with a firm but fair hand, increasing wages for the underpaid staff, authorizing repairs that had been deferred for years, meeting with tenant farmers to hear their concerns, and investing in improvements to their holdings that would benefit everyone in the long term. Word spread quickly through the countryside that the new mistress of Ravenmore was not the vengeful harpy society gossips had predicted, but a shrewd and generous landlord who understood both business and basic human decency. And Eleanor felt a satisfaction deeper than mere revenge in proving that nobility of character mattered more than nobility of birth. The weeks that followed established a strange rhythm within the walls of Ravenmore Estate, a carefully maintained dance of proximity and distance that left both Eleanor and the Duke constantly aware of each other's presence, even when they occupied different wings of the sprawling house. Eleanor would catch glimpses of him walking the grounds in the early morning, his tall figure moving through the mist-shrouded gardens with the heavy gait of a man carrying invisible burdens. And she knew he was revisiting the landscapes of his childhood, perhaps saying private goodbyes to a life that was slipping through his fingers like water. She told herself his obvious suffering meant nothing to her, that she felt no sympathy for a man who had caused her such profound pain, yet she could not help but notice the way his shoulders sagged when he thought no one was watching, the way his hand would reach out to touch a doorframe or windowsill, as though memorizing the texture of home through his fingertips. There were moments, brief and unwelcome, when Eleanor felt an uncomfortable stirring in her chest that might have been pity, and she would steel herself against it by remembering that ballroom, that public humiliation, the way he had looked through her as though she were made of glass. The Duke, for his part, seemed caught in his own private torment that went beyond mere financial ruin or loss of property. Eleanor began to notice the way his eyes would follow her when she moved through the rooms, not with desire exactly, but with a kind of bewildered assessment, as though he were trying to solve an equation that refused to balance. During their mandatory dinners, which had evolved from silent affairs to cautiously civil conversations, he would ask her questions about her life in Manchester, about Lord Blackwood's business ventures, about how she had learned to navigate the complicated world of investments and industrial enterprise. His tone held genuine curiosity rather than condescension, and Eleanor found herself answering more fully than she had intended, describing the satisfaction of making decisions that affected hundreds of workers' livelihoods, the intellectual challenge of predicting market trends, the way Lord Blackwood had treated her mind as something valuable rather than ornamental. She watched the Duke process this information with visible difficulty, saw him grappling with the reality that the woman he had dismissed as worthless possessed capabilities that far exceeded his own, and there was a grim pleasure in forcing him to confront the magnitude of his misjudgment. Society, meanwhile, had descended upon the situation with the gleeful voracity of vultures circling a carcass, and Eleanor found herself receiving more invitations and social calls than she could possibly accept. Women who had cut her dead 5 years ago now appeared in her drawing room with warm smiles and transparent attempts to secure invitations to any events she might host at Ravenmoor, their curiosity about the living arrangements barely concealed behind polite inquiries about her decorating plans and household stuff. The men were equally transparent in their sudden interest, their eyes calculating her worth down to the last pound sterling, their compliments flowing like honey now that she possessed both beauty enhanced by expensive grooming and a fortune that eclipsed most of their own. Eleanor received them all with perfect courtesy and absolutely no illusions about their motivations, keeping her responses deliberately vague about her plans for the estate and her intentions regarding the Duke. She understood that her power in this moment came partly from her wealth, but equally from her inscrutability, from keeping London society guessing about whether she would complete the Duke's destruction or offer him some unexpected mercy, and she had no intention of satisfying their curiosity before she was ready. Lady Margaret Thornfield proved to be the most interesting complication in this delicate situation, a woman whose pride was perhaps even more formidable than her son's, and whose adjustment to the new reality came with considerable resistance. The Dowager Duchess maintained a frigid correctness in her interactions with Eleanor, never openly rude, but never warm, her posture radiating disapproval of everything from Eleanor's management decisions to her fashion choices to her very existence as mistress of Ravenmoor. Eleanor might have found this hostility easier to dismiss, if not for the moments when she would catch Lady Margaret looking at her with something that resembled grudging respect, particularly after Eleanor had successfully negotiated a favourable contract with a difficult tenant, or made a decision that clearly benefited the estate's long-term prosperity. There was a conversation that occurred one afternoon in the library, where Lady Margaret had acknowledged in tones of brittle courtesy that Eleanor's management of the property exceeded anything her son had accomplished, and though the words were delivered without warmth, Eleanor recognized them for what they were, a concession from a woman who rarely conceded anything to anyone. It was during this period of careful coexistence that Eleanor began to notice changes in the Duke that went beyond his obvious discomfort with their reversed circumstances. He had taken to spending hours in the estate's library, poring over books on agricultural management and modern business practices with the intensity of a student preparing for crucial examinations. She would enter the room to find him surrounded by papers covered in calculations and notes, his elegant handwriting tracking crop rotations and investment strategies with a focus she had never witnessed in him before. When she asked about this sudden scholarly interest, he looked up at her with eyes that held something raw and undefended, and told her that he had been a fool living off the accomplishments of his ancestors without understanding the work required to maintain what they had built, and that watching her manage Ravenmoor with such competence had shown him exactly how unprepared he had been for the responsibilities of his title. The admission cost him something, she could see that, and Eleanor found herself responding with less satisfaction than she had expected, feeling instead a complicated mixture of vindication and something dangerously close to sympathy for the man who was finally, belatedly, beginning to understand the depth of his own failures. The turning point came on a night when autumn storms battered Ravenmoor estate with such ferocity that the ancient walls seemed to shudder under the assault of wind and rain. Eleanor had retired to her private sitting room after dinner, a cosy space she had claimed for herself, in what had once been a neglected morning room, now transformed with comfortable furniture and warm lighting into a sanctuary where she could review correspondence and business reports in peace. She was deep in a letter from her solicitor regarding a potential railway investment when a knock at her door interrupted her concentration, and she looked up to find the Duke standing in the doorway, his hair disheveled and his face pale with an emotion she could not immediately identify. He apologized for the intrusion with uncharacteristic awkwardness, explaining that he had been walking the corridors unable to sleep when he noticed light beneath her door, and before Eleanor could decide whether to dismiss him or invite him in, he spoke words that changed everything between them. He told her that he owed her the truth about that night 5 years ago, the real reason he had destroyed their engagement so publicly and cruelly, and that living under her roof and witnessing her grace and capability had made it impossible for him to continue carrying the weight of his deception alone. What followed was a confession that stripped away every assumption Eleanor had built around that terrible evening in the ballroom. The Duke explained that his father had died suddenly 3 months before their scheduled wedding, leaving behind not the solvent estate everyone believed in, but a catastrophic tangle of gambling debts and bad investments that threatened to destroy the Thornfield name completely. Lady Margaret had confided in him alone about the true state of their finances, swearing him to secrecy to protect the family's reputation, and together they had concluded that his only hope of salvation lay in marrying someone with a substantial fortune rather than someone who brought nothing but an ancient marriage contract and earnest good intentions. Miss Cecilia Hartley had been identified as the solution, her father's banking fortune representing the lifeline that could save Ravenmoor and preserve 3 centuries of family legacy. The Duke's voice broke as he described the impossible choice he had faced, torn between honoring his commitment to Eleanor and saving his family from complete ruin. And he admitted with devastating honesty that he had taken the coward's path by choosing cruelty over explanation, because he could not bear to see her look at him with understanding when he betrayed her. He had convinced himself that making her hate him would be kinder than making her pity him, and so he had crafted those terrible words in the ballroom to ensure she would leave London believing herself inadequate rather than knowing the truth about his family's disgrace. Eleanor sat frozen in her chair as this revelation washed over her, feeling the careful architecture of her anger begin to crack and shift beneath the weight of understanding she had never expected to receive. She wanted to reject his explanation, to insist that nothing could justify the humiliation he had inflicted upon her, but she could see the genuine anguish in his face as he continued speaking, describing how the marriage to Cecilia had been a disaster from the beginning. His new wife had shown her true nature within weeks of the wedding, spending money faster than her father could provide it, conducting affairs with barely concealed indiscretion, and ultimately orchestrating the disastrous investments that completed what his father's debts had begun. The Duke told Eleanor that he had paid for his choices with 5 years of misery, trapped in a marriage devoid of affection or respect, watching helplessly as everything his family had built crumbled around him despite his best efforts to save it. He described the particular torture of occasionally seeing her name in the financial papers, reading about Lady Blackwood's shrewd business dealings and growing fortune, and understanding with increasing clarity that he had destroyed his one chance at genuine partnership with a woman of real substance in favor of a beautiful facade that concealed only selfishness and greed. The silence that fell between them when he finished speaking felt alive with complicated emotions that neither seemed prepared to navigate. Eleanor studied his face in the firelight, searching for signs of manipulation or self-serving justification, but what she found instead was genuine remorse and a bone-deep weariness that came from years of living with consequences that had exceeded even his worst fears. She understood suddenly that he was not asking for forgiveness exactly, but offering her the truth as a gift he believed she deserved, and that this confession had cost him the last remnants of his pride. Eleanor found herself speaking without conscious decision, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her chest, telling him that she appreciated his honesty, but that it did not erase the years she had spent believing herself fundamentally unworthy of love or respect. She described the girl she had been in that ballroom, already uncertain of her place in his world, and how his words had confirmed every fear and insecurity she had harbored about her own value. She explained that Lord Blackwood had saved her not just materially but spiritually, teaching her to recognize her own worth when the world had told her she had none, and that she had built her current life on the foundation of hard-won self-respect that no longer required external validation. The Duke listened to her words with an intensity that seemed to physically pain him. and when she finished, he did something that shocked Eleanor to her core. He moved from the doorway to kneel before her chair, not in a theatrical gesture of romance, but with the humble posture of someone seeking absolution they knew they did not deserve, and told her that watching her these past weeks had taught him more about true nobility than his entire privileged upbringing had ever conveyed. He spoke of noticing how she treated the servants with respect, how she listened carefully to the tenant farmers' concerns, how she made decisions based on both practical wisdom and genuine care for those who depended upon her stewardship. He confessed that he had spent his life believing his title, and heritage made him inherently superior to others, and that seeing her exercise power with such grace and effectiveness had forced him to confront the uncomfortable truth that he had wasted his advantages through arrogance and ignorance. The Duke's voice dropped to barely above a whisper as he admitted that somewhere in these weeks of forced proximity, somewhere between resentment and observation, he had begun to fall in love with the woman she had become, and that this love felt like both a blessing and a punishment, because he understood with absolute clarity that he had forfeited any right to her affection through his own cruelty and cowardice. Eleanor's heart thundered in her chest as she looked down at the Duke kneeling before her. His proud head bowed in genuine supplication, and she felt the foundations of her carefully constructed defenses begin to tremble in ways that both terrified and exhilarated her. She had spent 5 years building walls around the wounded girl from that ballroom, transforming pain into ambition and humiliation into steel-spined determination, and now this man who had caused all that suffering was offering her something she had never expected to receive. Not just an apology, but a complete dismantling of his own pride, and a recognition of her worth that came too late, and yet somehow still mattered more than she wanted to. Damn it! Eleanor reached out with a trembling hand and touched his shoulder, the gesture gentle despite the storm of emotions raging through her, and asked him to rise because she could not bear to see him like this, could not process the complexity of her feelings, while he knelt at her feet like a penitent seeking absolution from a priest. When he stood, she saw tears on his face that he made no attempt to hide, and the raw vulnerability in his expression struck something deep within her that she had thought permanently calcified by disappointment and betrayal. They talked through the night as the storm raged outside, the conversation flowing with an honesty that neither had shared with another person in years. The Duke spoke of the loneliness of his marriage to Cecilia, describing evenings spent in separate wings of the house, her mocking laughter when he tried to discuss estate management or family responsibilities, the way she had made him feel simultaneously inadequate and trapped. He confessed that he had sometimes found himself thinking about Eleanor during those miserable years, wondering what kind of life they might have built together if he had possessed the courage to trust her with the truth about his family's financial troubles, rather than assuming she would be another burden he could not afford to carry. Eleanor, in turn, found herself sharing things she had told no one, describing the hollow months after leaving London when she had questioned whether she deserved to exist at all, the gradual healing that had come through Lord Blackwood's patient kindness, and the fierce determination that had driven her to succeed, not just for wealth but to prove to herself that she possessed value beyond what any man's approval could grant or revoke. She admitted that part of her motivation in purchasing Ravenmoor had indeed been revenge, a desire to make the Duke feel even a fraction of the powerlessness and humiliation she had experienced, but that watching him these past weeks had complicated her satisfaction in ways she was still trying to understand. The Duke listened to every word with an attention that felt like a physical caress, and Eleanor realized that this was perhaps what she had craved all along, not his suffering but his genuine seeing of her, his recognition that she was a person of depth and complexity, rather than a convenient solution to a social obligation or an embarrassing remnant of a broken contract. He asked her about her business ventures with real interest, and she found herself explaining the intricacies of railway investments and coal mine operations, watching his face light with understanding and respect as she described negotiations and strategies that had multiplied her fortune. There was something healing in being able to share this part of herself with someone who understood the world she now inhabited, and she noticed that the Duke asked intelligent questions that revealed he had absorbed more from his recent studies than she had credited. When he commented thoughtfully on one of her investment strategies, offering a perspective she had not considered, Eleanor felt a flutter of something dangerous in her chest, a recognition that this man possessed the capacity to be not just a reformed supplicant, but an actual intellectual partner. If given the chance to develop the potential she could now see, had always existed beneath his aristocratic conditioning. As dawn began to paint the sky beyond the windows with streaks of gold and rose, Eleanor and the Duke found themselves in a strange space of exhausted honesty, where old wounds had been aired and examined without resolution, but also without the poison of secrecy that had festered for so long. The Duke made no demands or assumptions about what his confession might have earned him, and Eleanor appreciated this restraint more than she would have thought possible, grateful that he seemed to understand that forgiveness could not be commanded or expected, but only offered freely if and when her heart decided it was ready. Before he left her sitting room, he paused at the door and turned back to look at her with eyes that held a mixture of hope and resignation, telling her that regardless of what she decided about him personally, he wanted her to know that she had already given him a gift beyond price by showing him what he could have been if he had chosen differently, and that watching her inhabit her power with such grace had taught him more about true nobility, in a few weeks than a lifetime of privilege had ever conveyed. Eleanor sat alone after he departed, watching the sunrise paint Ravenmoor Estate in shades of amber and gold, and felt something shifting inside her chest, a softening of the rigid certainty that had sustained her through 5 years of transformation and the careful planning of her return. The days following that storm-wrapped confession brought a subtle change to the atmosphere at Ravenmoor that the servants noticed even if they could not quite articulate what had shifted. Eleanor and the Duke still maintained appropriate distance in their daily interactions, still observed the careful protocols that their unusual living arrangement required, but there was a new quality to their exchanges that suggested depths beneath the surface civility. Eleanor caught herself seeking his opinion on estate matters more frequently than strictly necessary, valuing his input even as she recognized that her own judgment remained superior based on experience and education he had never received. The Duke, meanwhile, seemed to have abandoned his earlier brittleness, replacing defensive pride with a kind of earnest humility that made him far more approachable to everyone in the household, and Eleanor noticed that the servants who had initially treated him with awkward pity now responded to him with genuine warmth, as though they sensed in him something more authentic than the aristocratic mask he had worn before his fall from fortune. Eleanor found herself wondering, in quiet moments alone, whether the feeling stirring in her chest represented dangerous weakness or unexpected strength, whether opening her heart to the man who had broken it once before would be an act of forgiveness or foolishness, and what it might mean to choose love over vindication when the opportunity for both seemed to shimmer before her like competing paths, disappearing into an uncertain future. Helena spent the following weeks in a state of internal conflict that she found both frustrating and oddly exhilarating, her carefully ordered mind struggling to reconcile the satisfaction of her achieved revenge with the unexpected complication of feelings she had not anticipated developing. She had returned to London with such clear purpose, her plans for social vindication mapped out with the precision she applied to her business ventures, yet the Duke's confession had introduced variables that refused to fit neatly into her equations of justice and retribution. Eleanor found herself observing him with new eyes during their daily encounters, noticing details that her anger had previously obscured. The way he now listened to the head gardener's concerns with genuine attention rather than aristocratic dismissiveness. How he had begun taking meals with the senior household staff to better understand the practical workings of the estate, the careful notes he made during discussions about crop rotations and livestock management as though he were a student, determined to master material that had once seemed beneath his notice. These small transformations intrigued her precisely because they appeared motivated not by a desire to impress her or reclaim his former status, but by authentic recognition of his own previous inadequacies and a sincere wish to become worthy of the legacy he had nearly destroyed through negligence and pride. The turning point toward Eleanor's decision about how to proceed came during an afternoon ride across the Ravenmoor lands, an excursion she had planned to survey the tenant farms and assess the progress of improvements she had authorized. The Duke had asked permission to accompany her, explaining that he wished to see firsthand the changes she had implemented and to learn from her methods, and Eleanor had agreed with some hesitation, uncertain whether she was ready for extended private time in his company outside the structured environment of the house. They rode side by side through fields turning gold with approaching harvest, past cottages where tenants waved greetings with genuine warmth rather than the fearful deference they had once shown the old Duke. And Eleanor felt a complicated pride in what she had accomplished in such a short time. The Duke remained mostly silent during the early part of their ride, but she could see him absorbing everything, his gaze taking in the repaired fences, the healthy livestock, the children playing outside well-maintained homes, and she knew he was mentally comparing this scene to the neglected, struggling estate he had presided over, through indifference and ignorance. When they finally paused at a hillside overlooking the entire valley, the Duke spoke with a raw honesty that pierced through Eleanor's remaining defenses, telling her that seeing Ravenmoor thriving under her stewardship made him understand the true cost of his failures in ways that financial ruin never could, because she had proven that these lands and people deserved a guardian who actually cared about their well-being rather than simply viewing them as assets that existed to support an aristocratic lifestyle. Eleanor turned in her saddle to face him fully, studying his expression for any trace of manipulation or self-serving performance, but what she found was only genuine remorse and something that looked very much like wonder. She heard herself asking a question that had haunted her since that night of confessions, wanting to know whether his professed feelings for her stemmed from actual recognition of her worth or simply from gratitude that she had not completely destroyed him when she possessed every right and ability to do so. The Duke's response came without hesitation, his voice steady despite the emotion evident in his eyes, and he told her that he understood her skepticism, but that his love had nothing to do with gratitude or relief, and everything to do with witnessing who she truly was when given the freedom to exercise her capabilities, without constraint or condescension. He described specific moments that had captured his heart, watching her listen patiently to an elderly tenant's complaint about a boundary dispute, and then crafting a solution that satisfied all parties through creative compromise, observing her work late into the night over account books, because she refused to delegate financial decisions without first understanding every detail herself, seeing her treat the youngest scullery maid with the same courtesy she extended to visiting dignitaries, because she genuinely believed in the inherent dignity of every person regardless of their station. These were not the observations of a man seeking to flatter or manipulate, Eleanor realized, but the careful catalogue of someone who had been paying attention to details that revealed character rather than surface charm. The conversation that unfolded on that hillside felt like the true beginning of something entirely new between them, a tentative exploration of possibility that bore no resemblance to the arranged engagement of their past. Eleanor found herself sharing her vision for Ravenmoor's future, describing plans for a model village that would provide education for tenant children, improved medical care for workers, and profit-sharing arrangements that would give those who worked the land a stake in its prosperity. The Duke listened with an intensity that made her feel truly heard, occasionally asking questions that demonstrated he was not merely being polite, but genuinely engaging with her ideas, and at one point he offered a suggestion about water management that was actually quite clever, showing that his recent studies had begun to bear fruit. Eleanor felt something warm unfurling in her chest, a cautious hope that perhaps the man kneeling before her that stormy night had not been performing penance, but genuinely transforming, and that the partner she had once dreamed of finding might be emerging from the ruins of the proud, thoughtless aristocrat who had destroyed her younger self. She did not voice these thoughts aloud, not yet ready to make herself vulnerable by admitting how much his growth meant to her, but she suspected from the way he looked at her that he sensed the softening of her defenses and was wise enough not to push for more than she was prepared to give. As they rode back to the house in the golden light of late afternoon, Eleanor made a decision that both terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. She would host the grand ball she had been planning since purchasing Ravenmoor, but she would transform it from a simple display of her triumph into something far more significant, a test of the Duke's transformation and her own capacity for forgiveness, a public stage upon which they would either forge a new future together or definitively close the door on what might have been. The ball would serve as her vindication, yes, But it would also offer the Duke an opportunity to demonstrate before all of London society whether his private reformation translated into public courage, whether he possessed the strength to stand beside her, not as a fallen aristocrat accepting charity from his wealthy landlord, but as a man who had learned to recognize true worth and was willing to claim it, regardless of what society might think. Eleanor shared none of these thoughts with the Duke as they returned their horses to the stable, maintaining her customary reserve, even as her mind raced ahead to plan every detail of an evening that would reshape both their futures in ways she could only begin to imagine. The preparations for the grand ball at Ravenmoor Estate consumed the following weeks, with an intensity that left the entire household breathless with anticipation and speculation. Eleanor threw herself into the planning with the same meticulous attention to detail she applied to her business ventures, understanding that every element of the evening would be scrutinized by London society and would either cement her position as a woman of consequence or mark her as an upstart, attempting to buy her way into a world that would never truly accept her. She hired the finest musicians from London, ordered champagne from France that cost more per bottle than many families earned in a month, and worked with the head chef to create a menu that would be discussed in drawing rooms for months to come. The invitations themselves became objects of intense desire among the ton, their heavy cream cardstock embossed with Eleanor's personal seal, and she derived a certain grim satisfaction from watching women who had once cut her dead now maneuvering desperately to secure their place on her guest list. Eleanor knew exactly what they wanted. They craved the spectacle of seeing the Duke of Ravenmoor humbled in his own ancestral home. They hungered for details they could transform into gossip, and they hoped to witness whatever final act of revenge or mercy Eleanor had planned for the man who had once rejected her so cruelly and publicly. What none of them could know, what Eleanor kept locked away in the privacy of her own heart, was that her feelings about the Duke had evolved into something far too complex to satisfy their appetite for simple drama. She had caught herself seeking his company more frequently in recent days, finding excuses to consult with him about historical details of the house, or asking his opinion on elements of the ball's planning, and each conversation revealed more layers to a man she was discovering had always possessed depth. She had been too young and inexperienced to recognize during their first brief acquaintance. The Duke had thrown himself into helping with the preparations without being asked, coordinating with the groundskeepers to ensure the gardens would be at their peak beauty, personally overseeing the restoration of family portraits in the ballroom that had been allowed to deteriorate during his financial troubles, and working with the household staff to train additional servants hired for the evening with a patience and respect that would have be. Unthinkable from the arrogant man he had been 5 years ago, Eleanor watched him interact with a young footman who had accidentally broken a valuable vase, expecting anger, but witnessing instead a kind response that acknowledged the accident while encouraging the nervous young man not to let fear of mistakes prevent him from learning his duties properly. And she felt something shift irrevocably in her chest at this evidence of genuine character transformation. The week before the ball brought an unexpected complication in the form of visitors from Eleanor's past, specifically her distant cousins who had refused her shelter after the broken engagement and who now arrived with transparent attempts to re-establish family connections. They had severed so decisively 5 years earlier. Eleanor received them in Ravenmoor's drawing room with cool courtesy, listening to their effusive compliments about her success and their obvious hints about financial difficulties they currently faced, and she understood with perfect clarity that they viewed her wealth as something they were entitled to share, simply by virtue of distant blood relations. The Duke, who happened to enter the room during this uncomfortable visit, assessed the situation with quick intelligence and positioned himself subtly at Eleanor's side in a gesture of solidarity that did not go unnoticed by the grasping relatives. When they finally departed after Eleanor made polite but non-committal responses to their requests, the Duke commented quietly that he recognized the particular brand of hypocrisy that came from people who only valued you when you had something they wanted, and Eleanor realized with a start that he was speaking from his own painful experience with supposed friends and family who had disappeared when his fortune evaporated. This shared understanding of betrayal and the hollow nature of relationships based on status or wealth created an unexpected bond between them, a recognition that they had both learned difficult lessons about the difference between genuine loyalty and convenient association. The night before the ball, Eleanor found herself unable to sleep, her mind racing through endless scenarios of how the evening might unfold and what she truly hoped to achieve beyond the surface goal of social vindication. She rose from her bed and wandered through the quiet house, eventually finding herself in the ballroom, where servants had been working all day to transform the space into something magical. Moonlight streamed through the tall windows, illuminating the polished floors and the masses of flowers that perfumed the air with the scent of roses and jasmine, and Eleanor stood in the center of the empty room, remembering another ballroom 5 years ago, where her life had shattered into pieces she had never expected to reassemble. She was so lost in memory that she did not hear the Duke enter until he spoke her name softly, and she turned to find him standing in the doorway, wearing a dressing gown over his nightclothes, his hair disheveled from his own restless sleep. He apologized for intruding, but explained that he had seen light beneath the ballroom doors and wanted to ensure she was well, and Eleanor found herself admitting that she was nervous in ways that surprised her, uncertain whether she had the courage to execute the plan taking shape in her mind, a plan that would require her to make herself vulnerable before the very people who had once witnessed her deepest humiliation. The Duke crossed the ballroom to stand beside her, his presence solid and reassuring in the moonlit space, and he told her something that Eleanor would remember for the rest of her life. He said that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it, and that she had already demonstrated more bravery in the past 5 years than most people showed in a lifetime, by refusing to let shame and rejection define her, by building something meaningful from nothing, and by returning to face those who had hurt her with her head held high and her dignity intact. He confessed that watching her prepare for this ball had made him understand that true nobility had nothing to do with ancient titles or inherited estates, but everything to do with how one treated others when given power, and that regardless of what happened tomorrow evening, she had already proven herself to be the most genuinely noble person he had ever known. Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes at these words, not from sadness but from the overwhelming relief of being truly seen and valued for exactly who she was. And when the Duke reached out to take her hand in his, she did not pull away but instead let herself experience the simple comfort of connection with someone who understood both where she had been and what tomorrow's ordeal would cost her emotionally. They stood together in the moonlit ballroom for a long time, not speaking but drawing strength from each other's presence, and Eleanor realized that whatever happened at the ball, she was no longer facing it alone, but with a partner who had earned the right to stand beside her through his own hard-won transformation and genuine remorse. The evening of the ball arrived wrapped in perfect autumn weather, the sky clear and studded with stars that seemed to have aligned themselves specifically to illuminate Ravenmoor Estate in its finest glory. Eleanor, dressed with the assistance of her lady's maid, in a gown that had required 3 fittings and cost more than some families earned in a year, a creation of midnight blue silk overlaid with delicate silver embroidery that caught the light with every movement and made her look like she had been clothed in starlight itself. Her dark hair was arranged in an elaborate style, adorned with diamond pins that had once belonged to a Russian princess, and around her neck she wore a necklace of sapphires and diamonds so magnificent that her maid actually gasped when she fastened it in place. Eleanor studied her reflection in the mirror with a mixture of satisfaction and trepidation, seeing not the plain, forgettable girl from 5 years ago, but a woman of obvious wealth, beauty enhanced by the best resources money could provide, and hard-won confidence that radiated from her posture and expression. She understood that this transformation was armor as much as adornment, that she was dressing not just to impress but to claim her place in a world that had once deemed her unworthy, and that every expensive inch of her appearance served as silent testimony to how completely she had transcended the limitations others had tried to impose upon her. The guests began arriving as twilight deepened into true darkness, their carriages forming a glittering procession up the drive to Ravenmoor's entrance, where footmen stood ready to assist ladies in their jewels and gentlemen in their evening dress. Eleanor positioned herself in the receiving line with the Duke, standing subtly to one side, and she watched with keen attention as each arrival reacted to the sight of the two of them together, their faces revealing everything from shock to speculation to barely conceal delight at the drama they anticipated witnessing. The women who had cut her dead 5 years ago now curtsied with exaggerated respect, their eyes cataloguing every detail of Eleanor's appearance with the calculating assessment of those trying to determine how much her ensemble cost and where such pieces could be acquired. The men were even more transparent in their sudden admiration, their compliments flowing with an enthusiasm that would have been flattering if Eleanor did not understand perfectly that they were responding to her fortune and social position rather than any inherent qualities they had failed to notice when she was merely Miss Ashworth with no prospects. She received them all with gracious courtesy that revealed nothing of her inner thoughts, playing the role of perfect hostess while maintaining an emotional distance that left them uncertain whether she had forgotten or forgiven their previous cruelty. The ballroom filled steadily with the cream of London society, and Eleanor surveyed the crowd with the strategic eye of a general assessing the battlefield before engagement. She recognized faces from that terrible night 5 years ago, people who had witnessed her humiliation and contributed to the gossip that had followed her from London, and she felt a surge of vindication at seeing them now in her home, drinking her champagne, admiring her wealth and treating her with the deference they had once denied. Lady Margaret Thornfield had positioned herself near the fireplace, surrounded by her particular circle of aristocratic matrons, and though the Dowager Duchess maintained her characteristic reserve, Eleanor noticed that she wore a gown of exceptional quality and the Thornfield family diamonds, as though she too understood that this evening represented a battle for social position that required appropriate armor. The orchestra began playing, filling the room with music that seemed to shimmer in the candlelit air, and Eleanor felt the weight of hundreds of eyes upon her as guests speculated about when and how the evening's main drama would unfold, because surely the woman who had purchased the Duke's ancestral home out from under him had not gone to such elaborate expense simply to host a conventional ball. Eleanor had choreographed the evening's progression with the precision of a theatrical performance, understanding that timing and presentation would matter as much as the actions themselves. She danced first with several prominent gentlemen, including a marquis and an earl, demonstrating her acceptance by the highest ranks of society while keeping the Duke conspicuously absent from her dance card, and she could feel the speculation building with each partner, who was not the man everyone had come to see humiliated or redeemed. She made conversation with wives of powerful men, discussing investments and business ventures with a casual expertise that left them slightly disconcerted, unaccustomed to hearing such talk from a woman at a social event, and she knew that each unconventional moment was reinforcing her position as someone who operated by her own rules rather than society's expectations. The supper interval approached, traditionally the moment when the host or hostess would make any important announcements, and Eleanor felt her heart begin to race with a mixture of anticipation and genuine fear, because what she was about to do would either complete her vindication in the most satisfying possible way or expose her to a second devastating rejection before the same audience that had witnessed the first. As the guests assembled in the dining room, where tables had been arranged with elaborate centerpieces and place settings that represented the pinnacle of formal entertaining, Eleanor made her way to the head table where tradition dictated she should sit, but instead of taking her seat, she remained standing and waited for the conversation to quiet and all attention to focus upon her. The room gradually fell silent as people realized something significant was about to occur, and Eleanor felt the Duke's eyes upon her from where he stood near the doorway, having been relegated to a position appropriate for a guest rather than the master of the house he had once been. Eleanor drew a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment, and understanding that the next few minutes would determine not just the success of her social vindication, but the entire future trajectory of her life, and she began to speak in a voice that carried clearly to every corner of the room, thanking her guests for honoring Ravenmoor Estate with their presence and acknowledging that many of them remembered the last time she had attended a bee, all in London, a memory that she herself had carried for 5 long years. The room held its collective breath, waiting to see whether she would complete the Duke's destruction or offer him unexpected mercy. And Eleanor felt a strange calm settle over her as she prepared to do something far more radical than either option, something that would shock them all and reveal exactly how much she had learned about power, forgiveness, and the courage required to choose love over revenge. Eleanor continued speaking into the breathless silence, her voice steady despite the thundering of her heart, as she addressed the assembled guests who represented both her past humiliation and her present triumph. She told them that 5 years ago, she had been a young woman of no particular consequence, who had believed that an arranged marriage to a duke represented the pinnacle of what life could offer someone of her modest background, and that when that future had been stripped away in a moment of public rejection, she had felt as though her worth as a human being had been negated before witnesses who seemed to agree with the assessment that she was inadequate and unworthy. Eleanor watched faces in the crowd shift uncomfortably as she spoke, some having the grace to look ashamed, while others maintained expressions of avid curiosity about where this confession might lead, and she allowed the discomfort to build before continuing with the next part of her carefully constructed narrative. She explained that the intervening years had taught her lessons far more valuable than any aristocratic marriage could have provided, showing her that true worth came from character and capability rather than birth or beauty, and that the fortune she had built and the respect she had earned in the business world represented achievements that belonged entirely to her rather than being reflected glory from a husband's status or inherited position. The tension in the room had become almost unbearable, guests leaning forward in their seats with the avidity of spectators at a gladiatorial contest, waiting for Eleanor to deliver the blow that would complete the Duke's humiliation before the very society he had once commanded. Instead, Eleanor did something that would be discussed in London drawing rooms for years to come, something that demonstrated a sophistication of spirit that transcended simple revenge or vindication. She acknowledged that she had indeed purchased Ravenmoor Estate, with some element of satisfaction in reversing their positions, but that the weeks of living under the same roof as the Duke had revealed to her something she had not expected to discover, that people were capable of genuine transformation when forced to confront the consequences of their actions, and that the man who had rejected her 5 years ago bore little resemblance to the M.I. who now stood before them all, having learned through suffering and loss what privilege and pride had prevented him from understanding earlier. Eleanor's voice softened as she spoke about witnessing his efforts to become worthy of responsibilities he had once taken for granted, his genuine care for the people who depended upon Ravenmoor's prosperity, and his willingness to acknowledge his failures with a humility that was far more impressive than the arrogant certainty he had displayed in his previous life. The guests sat in stunned silence as Eleanor made her way across the dining room to where the Duke stood frozen near the doorway, his face pale and his eyes fixed upon her with an expression that mingled hope and terror in equal measure. She could hear the whispers beginning to ripple through the crowd, speculation building about what audacious action she was about to perform, and she felt a surge of power in knowing that she held this moment entirely in her hands, that every person in this room would remember what happened next for the rest of their lives. Eleanor stopped directly before the Duke, close enough that only he could hear when she whispered that she hoped he was prepared for what she was about to do, and she saw him nod slightly, his trust in her evident despite having no idea what she planned. Then, in a gesture that inverted every expectation and conventional social protocol, Eleanor did something that made several elderly matrons gasp audibly and caused Lady Margaret to grip the edge of the table as though she might faint. Eleanor, the woman of wealth and power who owned everything the Duke had lost, knelt before him in front of the entire assembly, reversing the position he had taken in her sitting room that stormy night in public, demonstrating that she viewed him not as a defeated supplicant, but as someone worthy of her respect and admiration. The shock that rippled through the dining room was almost tangible, faces registering disbelief that Eleanor would abase herself before the man who had once rejected her so cruelly, but she ignored them all and focused entirely on the Duke as she spoke words meant for him but carried clearly enough for all to hear. She told him that she had learned during their time together at Ravenmoor that redemption was not only possible, but precious when genuinely earned, and that watching him transform from an arrogant aristocrat into a man of authentic character and humility had taught her that forgiveness was not weakness, but perhaps the greatest strength a person could possess. Eleanor said that she had come to this ball intending to complete her social vindication by demonstrating her superiority over the man who had hurt her. but that somewhere between planning revenge and executing it, she had discovered something far more valuable than the satisfaction of seeing him humbled. She had found a partner worthy of standing beside her, not because of his title or his heritage, but because of the man he had chosen to become. When everything else was stripped away, the Duke's eyes filled with tears that he made no attempt to hide, and Eleanor saw in his face a naked vulnerability that made her certain she was making the right choice, however shocking it might appear to their audience. Then Eleanor rose gracefully to her feet and extended her hand to the Duke with a gesture that carried unmistakable meaning, and when he took it with trembling fingers, she announced to the assembled guests that she wished to introduce them not to the fallen Duke of Ravenmore living on her charity, but to the man she intended to marry if he would have her, the man who had taught her through his transformation that love based on genuine respect, shared values, was worth far more than any arrangement based on status or convenience. The dining room erupted in a chaos of reactions ranging from shocked exclamations to delighted applause, and Eleanor heard Lady Margaret's voice rise above the din, declaring in tones of aristocratic authority that if her son was wise, he would accept immediately before Eleanor came to her senses, which prompted surprised laughter that broke some of the tension. The Duke seemed incapable of speech for a long moment, simply staring at Eleanor, as though she were an apparition he feared might vanish if he blinked. And then he found his voice and said words that Eleanor would treasure forever, that she had honored him beyond anything he deserved or had dared to hope for, and that he would spend the rest of his life trying to be worthy of the extraordinary woman who had taught him what true nobility actually meant. And yes, 1,000 times yes, he would marry her if she would accept a man who came to her with nothing but love and the determination to be a partner equal to her in spirit, if not in accomplishment. The remaining hours of the ball passed in a blur of congratulations and barely concealed astonishment, as London society struggled to process the evening's unexpected turn from anticipated revenge drama to genuine romance triumphant. Eleanor and the Duke moved through the crowd together, no longer separated by the careful distance they had maintained earlier, and she noticed how guests who had come expecting to witness a humiliation now found themselves celebrating what appeared to be a love match that defied conventional expectations about how such stories should unfold. The dancing resumed with renewed energy, and when the Duke led Eleanor onto the floor for the first waltz they had ever shared, the symbolism was not lost on anyone present. This was the dance that should have occurred 5 years ago, delayed, but finally realized in a form more meaningful than the original would have been, because it was chosen freely by two people who understood each other's worth rather than mandated by a contract neither had. Truly wanted. Eleanor felt the Duke's hand firm against her back as they moved across the polished floor, and she allowed herself to fully experience the moment without the armor of skepticism or the weight of past wounds, trusting in the transformation she had witnessed and the future they had chosen to build together, despite everything that had tried to keep them apart. The wedding that followed 6 weeks later was a quieter affair than the ball had been, though no less significant for its relative intimacy. Eleanor insisted on a ceremony at the small parish church near Ravenmore rather than a grand London spectacle, wanting their union to be rooted in the place they would build their life together, rather than performed for the entertainment of society gossips. Lady Margaret attended with visible emotion, embracing Eleanor before the ceremony and whispering that she had been a foolish old woman to judge her so harshly years ago, and that she could see now that Eleanor was exactly the kind of strong, capable partner the Thornfield family needed to restore not just their fortune, but their moral standing. The Duke stood at the altar looking at Eleanor with such transparent devotion that several guests wept openly, and when they exchanged vows that they had written themselves, promising partnership and mutual respect alongside traditional pledges of love and fidelity, there was a sense that something genuinely new was being created, rather than simply an old pattern being repeated. Eleanor became the Duchess of Ravenmore in name as well as fact, but she insisted on maintaining her own business interests and continuing to sign contracts as Eleanor Blackwood Thornfield, a small but significant assertion that marriage did not erase the identity she had built through her own efforts during those years of exile and transformation. The years that followed proved that their unconventional beginning had laid the foundation for an equally unconventional and remarkably successful partnership. The Duke threw himself into learning estate management with the same intensity he had once devoted to avoiding it, working alongside Eleanor to transform Ravenmore into a model of progressive agricultural practices and fair labour treatment that attracted attention from reformers across England. They established schools for tenant children and profit-sharing arrangements for workers, using Eleanor's business acumen and the Duke's increasingly sophisticated understanding of agricultural science to prove that treating people with dignity and investing in their well-being was not just morally right, but economically sound. Eleanor continued to expand her business empire, now with a partner who could discuss investments and strategy with genuine understanding and who never felt threatened by her success or attempted to constrain her ambitions to fit conventional expectations of how a duchess should behave. They became known in London society as an unusual but undeniably successful couple, and their obvious affection for each other gradually shifted the narrative from scandal to romance, with young women beginning to cite their story as proof that true love could overcome initial mistakes and genuine character mattered more than perfect circumstances. 5 years after their wedding, Eleanor stood in the nursery at Ravenmore holding their infant daughter, while the Duke read to their 3-year-old son from a book about railway engineering, and she reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her from that devastating night in the ballroom to this moment of complete contentment. She had achieved vindication more satisfying than revenge could ever have been, not by destroying the man who hurt her, but by helping him become someone capable of genuine partnership, and in doing so had discovered that forgiveness could be a form of power rather than weakness when exercised from a position of strength rather than desperation. The daughter in her arms would grow up knowing that her mother had built an empire through intelligence and determination, that her father had possessed the courage to transform himself when confronted with his own failures, and that love earned through mutual respect and shared values was the only kind worth having. Eleanor looked across the nursery at the Duke, who glanced up from his reading to smile at her, with the warmth and admiration that had become his default expression when looking at his wife. And she felt grateful for every difficult moment that had led to this peace, understanding that sometimes the greatest happiness came not from avoiding pain, but from having the strength to grow beyond it. And so, dear listener, as this story reaches its conclusion in that peaceful nursery, where love and respect had created something beautiful from the ashes of pride and pain, perhaps you might take a moment to reflect on the truths it illuminates about your own life and possibilities. Eleanor's journey reminds us that rejection and humiliation, no matter how devastating they feel in the moment, do not define our ultimate worth or determine our final destination unless we allow them that power. Her story demonstrates that the opinion of those who judge us superficially matters far less than the character we build when no one is watching, and that true success is measured not by how effectively we punish those who hurt us, but by how completely we transcend the limitations they tried to impose. The Duke's transformation teaches us that it is never too late to recognize our failures, to humble ourselves before those we have wronged, and to become better versions of ourselves through honest self-examination and willingness to change. Perhaps most importantly, their ultimate union reminds us that love based on genuine respect, shared values, and mutual admiration is worth waiting for, worth working for, and worth choosing even when easier or more conventional options present themselves. So as you go forward from this moment, carrying their story with you, remember that your worth is inherent and unchanging, regardless of who recognizes it. That forgiveness exercised from strength is one of the most powerful forces in human experience, and that the greatest vindication comes not from proving others wrong, but from building a life so authentic and fulfilling that their initial judgment becomes irrelevant. Eleanor left that ballroom 5 years before believing her story had ended, but she was wrong. It was only beginning. And perhaps your own greatest chapters are still waiting to be written if you have the courage to move beyond past wounds and claim the future you deserve.